All those years.
I know everything, Father. The shift in power is now complete.
I saw her last week. Look how she's standing there. Cheers to the newlyweds. You shouldn't be here. I had to see you.
Thank you all. This is everything.
Thank you. This moment is beyond words. I never deserved your forgiveness.
Yes, you do. You earned it. Go inside now, Dad.
Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one nobody notices. Grace Carter's grandmother used to say, and as Grace stood in front of the small mirror hanging on her apartment wall, those words echoed in her mind. She gently smoothed the fabric of the navy blue dress she had owned for nearly 6 years. The dress was old, and the style was no longer fashionable, but it was clean, neatly pressed, and carefully cared for. She checked the invitation again, making sure she had the correct location. The wedding was being held at one of the most luxurious hotels in downtown Chicago, a place where crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars and valet attendants greeted guests arriving in luxury vehicles. For a moment, Grace considered staying home. She knew she would look different from the people attending. Most of them came from wealthy families, successful careers, and social circles she had never been part of. But the bride, Vanessa Whitmore, had once been her college friend, and despite the years that had passed, Grace believed it was the right thing to show up and celebrate someone's special day. An hour later, she stepped out of a rideshare vehicle and looked up at the grand entrance of the hotel. Guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits moved through the revolving doors, while photographers captured smiling faces beneath elegant floral arrangements. Grace took a slow breath and walked inside. Almost immediately, she felt the difference. Conversations softened as a few guests glanced in her direction. Some eyes lingered on her dress longer than necessary. Others quickly looked away. Grace told herself she was imagining it. She smiled politely and followed the signs toward the ballroom. The room was breathtaking. Golden lights reflected across polished marble floors, and dozens of round tables surrounded an enormous stage decorated with white roses. Grace had barely taken 10 steps into the ballroom before she noticed several women near the champagne station whispering to each other. One looked directly at her dress before leaning toward another guest. A man nearby smirked and quietly said something that caused 2 people to laugh. Grace pretended not to notice. She had spent most of her life learning how to ignore judgment. Still, the atmosphere felt different. The whispers seemed to follow her as she crossed the room. She found her name on the seating chart and noticed her assigned table was tucked near the back corner of the ballroom, far from the bridal party and far from the VIP section. As she walked toward it, she became aware of another presence in the room. At the center table near the front sat an older gentleman with silver hair and a calm expression. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't talking. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't even looking at the stage. His eyes quietly followed the movement of guests throughout the ballroom. For a brief moment, his gaze met Grace's. Then he looked away. Grace thought nothing of it and continued toward her seat. Around her, the whispers grew slightly louder, and somewhere across the ballroom, a woman's amused laugh cut through the music. Grace sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and reminded herself she was only there to celebrate a wedding. What she didn't know was that before the night was over, every person in that ballroom would remember exactly who she was. Grace tried to focus on the soft piano music drifting through the ballroom, but the atmosphere around her felt increasingly uncomfortable. She sat quietly at her assigned table while guests continued to arrive, filling the room with laughter and conversation that operated by different rules. She worked hard, paid her bills, and treated people with kindness, yet somehow that seemed invisible compared to expensive clothing and social status. A sudden burst of laughter caught her attention. Near the front of the room, a group of bridesmaids had gathered around Ashley Reed. Ashley was known for commanding attention wherever she went, and tonight was no exception. Her designer gown shimmered beneath the ballroom lights as she spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Grace could not make out every word, but she noticed Ashley glance in her direction several times. Each glance was followed by another round of laughter. A knot formed in Grace's stomach. She reached for a glass of water and took a sip. Moments later, a woman seated beside her leaned closer. "Are you here for the bride?" she asked politely. Grace smiled and nodded. "We went to college together." The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Really? That is surprising." Before Grace could ask what she meant, the woman offered an awkward smile and turned away. The comment lingered in Grace's mind. She could not tell whether it was intended as an insult or simply careless curiosity, but either way it left her feeling smaller than before. The ballroom doors opened again, drawing everyone's attention toward the entrance. More distinguished guests entered, including local business leaders and executives whose names appeared regularly in newspapers and industry magazines. Several people immediately crossed the room to greet them. Yet among all the arrivals, one person remained seated. William Harrison sat calmly at the VIP table, observing everything with quiet patience. He rarely spoke, but people frequently approached him to shake his hand. Grace noticed that although he acknowledged each greeting, his attention often drifted back toward the crowd. Once again, his eyes settled briefly on her. There was no judgment in his expression, only curiosity. Meanwhile, the whispers continued spreading from table to table. Grace heard fragments now. Comments about her dress. Questions about why she had been invited. Speculation about whether she had misunderstood the events. Level of formality. She kept her posture straight and refused to react, but inside she could feel the pressure building. The evening had barely begun, and already she sensed that someone was preparing to make her the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Grace was staring down at the ice melting in her water glass when she heard her name for the first time that evening. "Grace Carter, right?" The voice came from only a few feet away. She looked up and saw Ashley Reed standing beside her table with several bridesmaids gathered around her. Their smiles looked pleasant enough at first glance, but something in Ashley's eyes made Grace uneasy. Conversations at nearby tables began to quiet as people sensed an interaction worth watching. Grace offered a polite smile. "Yes, it has been a long time." Ashley glanced at the dress and then back at Grace. "Wow, you still have it." A few bridesmaids exchanged looks. Grace frowned slightly. "Still have what?" Ashley laughed softly. "That dress. I think I remember seeing it years ago." Several people nearby chuckled. Grace felt heat rising in her face but kept her composure. "It has lasted a long time." "Clearly," Ashley replied. More laughter followed. The comments were not openly cruel, but each one carried a sharp edge hidden beneath a smile. Grace could feel dozens of eyes turning toward her table. She wanted the conversation to end, but Ashley appeared determined to continue. "You know," Ashley said, folding her arms, "when I heard you were coming tonight, I was curious about what you would wear. I guess some things never change." One bridesmaid covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Another looked away, appearing slightly uncomfortable. Grace remained calm. "I am happy to be here for Vanessa. That is what matters." Ashley tilted her head. "Of course, it is just that this wedding has a certain standard. Most people made a real effort." The words landed harder than the earlier jokes. A few guests at neighboring tables suddenly became very interested in their drinks, while others openly watched the exchange. Grace could hear faint whispers spreading through the ballroom again. She felt trapped between standing up for herself and avoiding a scene. "I did make an effort," she said quietly. Ashley's smile widened. "If you say so." The bridesmaids laughed again. This time the sound carried farther across the room. Grace noticed several guests turning in their chairs to see what was happening. The attention she had hoped to avoid all evening was now focused directly on her. At the front of the ballroom, William Harrison lifted his gaze from a conversation he had been having with another executive. His eyes moved toward the growing crowd around Grace's table. He said nothing, but he continued watching. Meanwhile, Ashley seemed encouraged by the audience gathering around her. "Do not get me wrong," she said. "It is actually kind of inspiring. Most people would be embarrassed to show up dressed like that. You must have a lot of confidence." The sarcasm was impossible to miss. A few guests laughed openly now. Grace felt the sting of humiliation settle deeper in her chest. She had spent years overcoming obstacles, working long hours, and carrying herself with dignity. Yet in this room none of that mattered. People saw only an old dress. She lowered her eyes for a moment, hoping the attention would fade. Instead, the whispers grew louder. Somewhere across the ballroom, another guest repeated Ashley's comment, triggering another wave of laughter. And for the first time that evening, Grace began to wonder whether coming to this wedding had been a mistake. Grace forced herself to remain seated even as the laughter around her slowly faded into scattered whispers. Ashley eventually returned to the group of bridesmaids, apparently satisfied with the attention she had received. But the damage had already been done. The room felt different now. Before, people had merely noticed Grace. Now they were actively talking about her. Every glance seemed heavier. Every whispered conversation felt connected to her presence. She stared at the elegant centerpiece on her table and wished she could disappear into the crowd. A few minutes later, the ballroom lights softened slightly as guests began settling into their seats for the upcoming ceremony. Grace hoped the focus would finally shift away from her. Instead, she heard another familiar voice approaching. Vanessa Whitmore had arrived. The bride looked stunning in her custom wedding gown, drawing admiration from nearly everyone in the room. Guests stood to greet her while cameras flashed around the ballroom. Vanessa smiled graciously at the attention until her eyes landed on Grace. For a brief second, her expression changed. She exchanged a look with Ashley before walking directly toward the back of the room. Grace stood politely. "Vanessa, congratulations. You look beautiful." Vanessa barely acknowledged the compliment. Her eyes moved slowly over Grace's dress. "You actually came." The words caught Grace off guard. "Of course. You invited me." Vanessa gave a small laugh. "Honestly, I did not think you would show up." Several nearby guests turned their attention toward the conversation. Grace felt her stomach tighten. "Why would I not come?" Vanessa glanced around as if searching for support from the people listening. "I just assumed you would realize this event is a little different from our college days." A few guests smiled awkwardly. Others openly watched. Grace remained calm. "I came because I wanted to celebrate your wedding." Vanessa folded her arms. "That is thoughtful. Although I have to admit, I was surprised by your choice of outfit." More eyes shifted toward Grace's dress. Someone at a neighboring table quietly laughed. Grace could feel her face growing warm again. "It was the best dress I had." Vanessa raised her eyebrows. "Really? The best?" Ashley covered her mouth as she laughed. Several bridesmaids joined her. The humiliation that had started as whispers was now unfolding openly in front of dozens of guests. What hurt most was not the mockery itself. It was the realization that Vanessa seemed to enjoy it. Grace remembered late-night study sessions, shared meals, and years of friendship. Yet standing here now, she felt like a complete stranger. "I am happy for you, Vanessa," Grace said quietly. "That is why I came." Instead of softening, Vanessa simply smiled. "Well, try not to attract too much attention tonight." The comment triggered another round of laughter from nearby guests. Grace heard. It spread across several tables. No one stepped forward to defend her. No one told Vanessa to stop. People simply watched. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed entertained. Across the ballroom, William Harrison observed everything from his seat. His expression remained unreadable, but unlike everyone else, he never laughed. As Vanessa walked away surrounded by admirers, Grace slowly sat back down. For the first time that evening, she seriously considered leaving before the ceremony even began. Grace remained seated as guests began moving toward the ceremony area, but her attention was no longer on the wedding. She kept replaying the comments in her mind, wondering how an evening that was supposed to celebrate love had become an exercise in humiliation. Part of her wanted to stand up, walk out of the ballroom, and never look back. Another part refused to give the people whispering about her the satisfaction. She had done nothing wrong. She had arrived with respect, followed every instruction on the invitation, and wished the bride well. Yet somehow she had become the evening's easiest target. Around her, conversations continued. Guests shared stories, laughed, and admired the extravagant decorations while Grace sat quietly at the edge of it all. A server approached and offered a tray of sparkling water. Grace thanked him with a warm smile. The young man smiled back and wished her a pleasant evening. It was a small interaction, but after everything that had happened, simple kindness felt surprisingly meaningful. Across the room, William Harrison continued observing the ballroom from his VIP table. Several prominent business leaders sat beside him, discussing investments and upcoming projects. William answered their questions politely, but his attention repeatedly drifted toward the back of the room. One executive noticed, "William, you seem distracted tonight." William glanced toward Grace's table before returning his gaze to the conversation. "I am simply paying attention," the executive laughed. "To what?" William took a sip of water. "To character." The man looked confused, but William offered no further explanation. Meanwhile, Ashley and several bridesmaids continued circulating through the ballroom. Every time they passed Grace's table, another comment seemed to emerge. None of them were severe enough to cause a public confrontation. That was what made them effective. They arrived disguised as jokes, observations, and harmless remarks. Yet together they created a steady pressure that never allowed Grace to relax. At one point, Grace overheard someone asking whether she had mistaken the wedding for a charity event. Another guest wondered aloud if the dress had come from a thrift store. A few people laughed. Others simply listened. Nobody challenged the comments. The silence of the crowd began hurting more than the words themselves. Grace looked around the room and realized something unsettling. Many of the people present knew the comments were unfair. She could see it in their expressions. Yet almost none of them were willing to risk becoming unpopular by speaking up. It was easier to remain spectators. As the ceremony start time approached, guests gradually took their seats. Soft music filled the ballroom again. The atmosphere should have felt joyful, but an uncomfortable tension lingered beneath the surface. Grace sensed it. William sensed it. Even some of the guests seemed aware that something was unfolding beyond the wedding itself. For the first time all evening, Grace glanced toward the exit doors and seriously considered leaving before the ceremony began. She gathered her purse and placed it on her lap. If she stood up now, she could be gone in less than 2 minutes. No confrontation. No explanation. No more humiliation. She took a slow breath and prepared to make her decision, completely unaware that several sets of eyes were watching her, including the one person in the ballroom who had remained silent since the moment she arrived. Grace tightened her grip on her purse and slowly pushed her chair back from the table. The decision felt painful, but staying felt worse. She had spent the entire evening trying to preserve her dignity, while others treated her like an unwelcome guest. If she left now, at least she could leave on her own terms. Around the ballroom, guests continued settling into their seats as the ceremony preparations moved forward. The musicians adjusted their instruments, photographers checked their equipment, and servers quietly cleared empty glasses. To everyone else, it looked like a perfect wedding evening. To Grace, it felt like a place where she no longer belonged. She took a step away from the table and began walking toward the ballroom entrance. A few nearby guests noticed. Some exchanged knowing looks. Others seemed relieved that the uncomfortable situation might finally disappear on its own. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked if she was all right. The silence followed her with every step. Then she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Leaving already?" Grace turned and saw Ashley approaching with 2 bridesmaids beside her. Ashley wore the same confident smile that had followed her throughout the evening. "I just thought I would head home," Grace replied calmly. "The ceremony has not even started yet," Ashley said. "Although I suppose this event may not really be your scene." The bridesmaids laughed softly. Grace felt the sting but refused to react. "I came to support Vanessa. That is all." Ashley tilted her head. Well, perhaps it is for the best. Weddings can be awkward when guests do not quite fit in. Several nearby people overheard the remark. A few smiled. Others looked down, unwilling to get involved. Grace realized that Ashley was not interested in conversation. She wanted an audience. Every comment was designed to make Grace feel smaller in front of as many people as possible. Before Grace could respond, another voice joined the conversation. Vanessa had arrived once again. "What is going on?" she asked. Ashley gestured toward Grace. She was leaving. Vanessa looked at Grace and shrugged. Honestly, that might be easier for everyone. The words landed harder than anything she had said earlier. Grace stared at her, struggling to understand how someone she once considered a friend could be so dismissive. Easier for everyone? Grace repeated. Vanessa folded her arms. "You have been attracting a lot of attention tonight." A few guests laughed. Others turned fully toward the scene now unfolding near the ballroom entrance. The crowd was growing. Grace could feel dozens of eyes watching her. This was no longer a private embarrassment. It had become public entertainment. For a moment she considered defending herself, but exhaustion replaced anger. She simply nodded. "I understand." She turned toward the exit again. Then something unexpected happened. Across the ballroom, a chair moved. The sound was not loud, yet it somehow cut through every conversation in the room. Heads turned toward the VIP section. Business executives stopped talking. Servers paused in place. Even the musicians looked up. William Harrison had risen from his seat. The powerful chairman who had remained silent all evening was now standing, and for reasons nobody understood, his eyes were fixed entirely on Grace Carter. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The ballroom seemed frozen in place as William Harrison stepped away from the VIP table. Conversations stopped. The soft music faded into the background. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that something unexpected was happening. Grace stood near the exit, confused by the sudden attention. She had noticed William throughout the evening, but she had no idea why the chairman was now walking toward her. Ashley's confident smile began to fade. Vanessa looked equally puzzled. The guests who had laughed only moments earlier now watched in complete silence. William moved calmly through the crowd, acknowledging no one. Several executives instinctively stood as he passed. Others stepped aside to clear a path. His reputation carried enormous weight. People listened when he spoke. People paid attention when he moved. And tonight, he was walking directly toward the woman everyone else had been mocking. Grace felt her heart beating faster. When William finally reached her, he stopped only a few feet away. His expression remained calm, but there was something unmistakably firm in his eyes. He looked at Grace first, not at Vanessa or Ashley. "Are you leaving?" he asked. The question was simple, yet it sounded different from all the others she had heard that evening. There was no judgment in it. No hidden insult, just genuine concern. Grace hesitated. "I think it is probably best." William nodded slowly. "And why is that?" Before Grace could answer, Ashley stepped forward with an eager smile. "Mr. Harrison, there is really no issue. We were just having a little fun." William turned toward her. The room became even quieter. Ashley's smile immediately looked less certain. "Fun," William repeated. Nobody laughed this time. Ashley glanced around nervously. "Nothing serious, just harmless jokes." William said nothing for a moment. The silence felt heavier than any speech. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others suddenly became fascinated by the centerpieces on their tables. William then looked toward Vanessa. "And you agree?" Vanessa forced a polite smile. "Of course. Everyone is enjoying themselves." William's gaze lingered on her for a few seconds. "Interesting." One word. That was all he said. Yet the discomfort spreading through the ballroom became impossible to ignore. Grace could feel the mood shifting. For the first time all evening, the people who had been whispering seemed unsure of themselves. William turned back toward Grace. "I have been watching since you arrived." The statement surprised everyone. A murmur moved through the crowd. Grace looked genuinely confused. "Watching me? William nodded. Yes. More whispers spread across the ballroom. Ashley and Vanessa exchanged nervous glances. Neither of them understood where this conversation was heading. Neither did anyone else. The chairman had not raised his voice. He had not revealed any secret. Yet somehow the balance of power in the room had completely changed. William looked around the ballroom, taking in the faces of the guests who had spent the evening judging a woman they barely knew. Then he returned his attention to Grace. "Before you walk out that door," he said calmly, "there is something everyone here deserves to hear." The room fell silent once again. Whatever William Harrison was about to say, every person in the ballroom suddenly knew it was going to change the entire evening. No one moved. No one spoke. The ballroom that had been filled with laughter only minutes earlier now felt as quiet as a courtroom awaiting a verdict. "William." Harrison slowly looked around the room before speaking again. "Many of you have spent the evening discussing a dress," he said. "You noticed the fabric. You noticed the age of it. You noticed what it was not. But none of you stopped long enough to ask what it meant." The guests exchanged uncertain glances. Ashley's confidence continued to fade. Vanessa remained frozen beside her. Grace stood near the exit, completely bewildered. William turned toward her. "Grace, would you mind if I shared something?" Grace hesitated before nodding. William smiled gently. 3 years ago, our foundation launched a scholarship program for students facing severe financial hardship. Thousands applied. Only a handful were selected. Several guests recognized the foundation's name immediately. It was one of the largest charitable organizations in the state. William continued. "During the selection process, we reviewed grades, recommendations, and personal essays. Most applicants talked about their ambitions. One applicant spent nearly her entire essay talking about someone else." He paused. The room listened carefully. "She wrote about her grandmother." Grace's eyes widened. William nodded toward her. That applicant was Grace Carter. A ripple of surprise spread through the ballroom. William continued. "Her grandmother raised her alone, worked multiple jobs, sacrificed everything so her granddaughter could attend school. When her grandmother became seriously ill, Grace postponed opportunities, worked extra shifts, and spent every spare dollar helping her family." The silence grew heavier. Most people would never know that story because Grace never used it to gain sympathy. She never asked for attention. She simply kept doing the right thing. Several guests lowered their eyes. William's voice remained calm. "A year after receiving our scholarship, Grace sent our foundation a handwritten letter, not asking for money, not requesting favors. She sent a donation." The crowd looked stunned. The donation was small compared to what many people in this room spend on dinner. But it represented something far greater. Grace wanted another struggling student to have a chance. Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes. She had never expected anyone to remember that letter. William then looked directly at the dress. "The reason I recognized that dress is because I saw it in the scholarship interview." A murmur swept through the ballroom. Grace wore it when she walked into a room full of executives and answered every question with honesty, humility, and courage. 3 years later, she is wearing the same dress. Not because she lacks character. Not because she lacks dignity. She wears it because she values responsibility more than appearances. The room fell completely silent. Every joke suddenly sounded cruel. Every whisper suddenly sounded shallow. William turned toward the crowd one final time. "Tonight, many people judged a woman based on a dress. I judged her based on what she does when nobody is watching." No one could meet his eyes. The truth had finally been revealed, and the people who had laughed the loudest now appeared the smallest in the room. The silence that followed William Harrison's words felt unlike anything Grace had experienced before. Just minutes earlier, she had been preparing to leave through the ballroom doors, convinced that nobody in the room saw her as anything more than a woman wearing an old dress. Now every eye was fixed on her for an entirely different reason. The whispers were gone. The laughter had disappeared. In their place stood an uncomfortable awareness that many people had judged someone they never truly knew. Grace lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by emotions she could barely process. William stepped closer and spoke gently. Grace, there is one more thing. The room listened. A few months ago, our foundation began searching for someone to lead a new mentorship initiative for young students facing financial hardship. We reviewed dozens of candidates. We interviewed professionals with impressive resumes and years of experience. Yet the person we kept coming back to was someone who understood struggle firsthand. Grace looked up in surprise. William smiled. You! A murmur spread through the ballroom once again, but this time it sounded very different. Several guests stared at Grace with genuine admiration. William continued. Character cannot be purchased. Integrity cannot be rented. Compassion cannot be inherited. Those qualities are earned, and you have earned them. Grace felt tears forming in her eyes. She had spent years working quietly, never expecting recognition. The idea that someone had noticed her efforts seemed almost impossible to believe. Across the room, Vanessa stood frozen. The confidence that had carried her through the evening was gone. Ashley looked equally uncomfortable. Neither woman knew what to say. Their jokes now seemed embarrassingly small compared to the story that had just been revealed. William turned toward the crowd. Tonight should be a celebration of love, friendship, and respect. I hope everyone here remembers that the value of a person is never determined by clothing, wealth, or status. Several guests nodded. Others looked visibly ashamed. Then something unexpected happened. A woman seated near the front slowly began to applaud. Another guest joined her. Then another. Within seconds, the sound spread throughout the ballroom. One table after another joined in until the entire room was filled with applause. Grace stood motionless as hundreds of hands came together around her. It was not applause for wealth. It was not applause for influence. It was applause for resilience, kindness, and dignity. Many guests rose to their feet. The standing ovation continued for nearly a minute. Grace had never experienced anything like it. For the first time that evening, she smiled. It was a genuine smile, free from embarrassment and fear. William extended his hand. I hope you will stay for the ceremony. Grace nodded. I would like that. Together they walked back toward the center of the ballroom. The same guests who had ignored her earlier now greeted her warmly. Some apologized. Others simply offered respectful smiles. As Grace took her seat once again, she thought about her grandmother's words. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one nobody notices. Tonight, everyone had noticed the dress. In the end, what they remembered was the woman wearing it.
Before you leave, take a moment to think about Grace. In a room filled with wealth, status, and appearance, the person who carried the greatest value wasn't the one who wearing the expensive suit or wearing the finest jewelry. It was the woman who carried herself with a quiet dignity when everyone else chose judgment. How often do we make decisions about people before we knowing their story? A wore-out dress, an old car, a tired face, or maybe a nervous smile. Sometimes we see those things and assume we know everything. But the truth is, every person is fighting a battle that we cannot see, carrying an experience that we cannot imagine. The guests at the wedding believed that they were measuring Grace. In reality, Grace revealed who they truly were. Because character is not tested when they meet successful people. Character who is tested when they meet the people who appear to have less than we do. Character is tested when they meet people who appear to have less than we do. The greatest lesson from this video is respect should never earn through money. Kindness should never depend on status. And human worth should never be measured by appearances. The next time you meet someone the world overlooked, remember Grace Carter. The most important in the room may be the one that nobody noticed. And sometimes the greatest wealth a person can possess is a heart that never forgets how to treat people with dignity. Thank you for watching. May we all choose kindness before judgment. And if you like this video, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below.